friends, welcome to Kevin Teaches Music. In today's lesson, we are doing a little bit of ear training. And in particular, I am going to show you the exercise that I just did and a couple of variants thereof and give you some tips on how to do it and explain why it is a good exercise to do and why it's an important skill to learn. So, let's jump right into it. This is an extension of an exercise that we use in an a cappella group that I sing with. In particular, we use this for auditions. So we ask the singer, we give the prospective singer, we give him a note, and we ask him to sing, starting from that note, up a half step, a whole step, a minor third, a major third, a perfect fourth, an augmented fourth, and a perfect fifth, which are simply intervals increasing by a half step each time. And then we ask the singer to then do the same intervals going down. So what that sounds like is this. And then down. And it's really kind of interesting how difficult that can be, especially to do a cappella without any accompaniment. And what it does is those of us who are on the audition panel, or hearing the new singer, it helps us judge whether this person has a good internal spatial memory for pitches. Or an awareness of how far intervals are, especially in an a cappella setting. And it also gives us an idea of the person's ability to keep one pitch steady while doing a wide variety of sort of unrelated other pitches and oscillating between the two. So, the question is, can you keep that initial note in your head while you have to sort of calculate, if you will, all these other pitches. So let's actually start. So sorry, what I meant to say is that with the original exercise only goes up to the fifth. Now in the intro to this video, I took it all the way up to the octave, and I think that is actually a useful skill to have, is to go all the way up to the octave. Above an octave can be useful. But, of course, as you guys probably know, those intervals will be, the intervals above an octave will simply be repeats, in a sense, of the intervals that are contained within one octave. They do have a different sound, but for example, a ninth will be the same type of interval as a second. It's just that the resulting note will be one octave higher than it would be in a ninth as compared to a second. So, for example, a second would be D, E, and a ninth would be D, E. So it's still an E, it's just up an octave. So usually, once you get, for example, the second down, you should be able to do a ninth. It'll sound a little weird, it'll be a little jarring, but if you can go da-da, you can probably go da-da. It's just up an octave. So anyway, but let's start with the first few, so the ones that take us up to a fifth. All right? So, da-da. Now that, most people know that one. Most people that have some familiarity with music will know that one. That's a half step. That's the smallest interval that we use in... I don't want to say use in Western music because we do bend notes, we do slide and have a portamento, basically pitches between the piano pitches. But in terms of composition, mainstream composition, piano-based or 12-tone-based composition, that would be the smallest interval. It's also the Jaws interval, right? Now, why does it sound ominous? I don't know, that's kind of a good question, actually. Well, maybe it sounds ominous because the notes the two notes being so close together, harmonically, they don't really form part of any chord. There's really no. If you actually look at the frequencies of those two notes, there's not a lot in common. And when I say in common, what I really mean is that the frequencies are not related to each other by any sort of mathematical ratio. For example, an octave, the frequency of the higher note is exactly 2 times the frequency of the lower. So that's a very simple relationship. And even a perfect fifth, caveat, a piano doesn't actually have a harmonically perfect fifth. But if you sing a perfect fifth in a vocal ensemble, in an a cappella ensemble, for example, that should be a ratio of 3-2 between the upper and lower notes. So those are intervals that are going to naturally sound very pleasing to the ear because the ear picks up on that ratio. The air vibrating actually, is hitting your eardrum. And if one wave is hitting it a certain number of times per second and the other one is hitting it twice that number of times, or 3/2, at that ratio, your brain actually can pick up on that and interprets that as consonants, right? But, so all of that is to say, but a half step has no such quality. So a half step is really kind of a human interval, and a man-made interval. It's an interval that we it doesn't result from any mathematical ratio. It's just an interval that we sort of invented in order to make our scales and tuning systems work the way that we wanted them to. So all that is to say that it has a very sort of dark and dissonant sound. The notes are very, very close together, right? It's probably going to be the smallest interval that you can reliably sing with your own voice. Probably. Now, it is possible to sing, you can go da 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 da. Well, let me try that again. I'm going to try to see if I can sing 4 pitches from D to E flat. Let's see. Da 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 da. I still went too far. So I probably could get 2 or 3. I can probably hear 2 or 3 pitches between that half step, but that's stretching it. And this is something that I do a lot of. So for most folks, the half step is probably going to be the smallest interval that you're familiar with hearing. Ya-da-dum. Right? So think of that Jaws theme. Or you could think of... trying to think of another thing. Oh, well, a nice descending half-step motive is that opening of Für Elise by Beethoven. Of course, that's descending, so that doesn't really help us with ascending, but it does sort of maybe help you get the sound in your ear. So, let's practice a few half-steps. I'll play the initial note, and then you sing the initial note, which should match what I'm playing on the piano, and then try to go up to that half step, and then hold that note, and then I will play the half step up and see if you match. So, for example, I'll demonstrate. Initial note. La, and then la. Right? So you do the interval on your own, and then check it against the piano. So, sorry. So I will be the pianist here. So here's the first pitch. La. Were you able to get that pitch? Let's try it again. So by the way, when I do this nod and I don't do anything, that's supposed to be you singing the second note. All right, let's try it again. La. One thing to check for is there should be a very crunchy dissonance if you sing a half step harmonically, meaning if you are holding out one note and singing the half step above. So, for example, that's the right sound. So don't shy away from that. You want that crunch, right? And some of you might be thinking, "Oh, that's such a terrible sound. Why would anyone ever use that sound?" Well, we uh, composers use that sound in order to create a sense of release when we move from that into a consonance. So, for example, something like that. We started with the dissonance, released into a consonance, and then I just continued the motive outwards just for fun. But, so that is the half step. Now, after that lengthy discussion, we have to move on to whole step. So the whole step is actually surprisingly hard. A lot of people think this would be the easiest one. But I've noticed people often sing whole steps out of tune. It's very strange. And I think it's because, I don't know, maybe we have this like societal obsession with half steps. I don't know if that makes any sense, but like the half step is kind of a pervasive motif in terms of like scary music or whatever. But the whole step, I don't know, it's a little bit more vague and kind of light. I sort of see it as being an interval that's slightly dissonant, but not so much so that it's like famously so, right? So it kind of slips under the radar because thirds, which are the ones that are coming up later, are the foundations of chords and harmony. So they're incredibly famous. Everybody loves thirds, right? It's like everybody and their mother is like obsessed with thirds. But major seconds sometimes slip under the radar. So I've noticed sometimes with my students when I'll play this note and I'll ask them to sing a major second, they'll either go na na, which is a half step, or they'll go na na, which is a minor third. And that's because they're attracted to either that very dissonant sound or the more consonant sound that forms the basis of our chords. But it's not every day that you sing na na la la. It's kind of a weird sound, isn't it? You'll get this on wind chimes, though. I like to talk about wind chimes a lot for some reason, but wind chimes are usually tuned to these pentatonic scales, so you will have whole steps in pentatonic scales, like that. Now, there's a minor third in the middle there, so I'm sort of cheating, but that's a whole step, that's a whole step, and that's a whole step. So the major third just needs to be a little bit bigger than the minor third, but it shouldn't have the mellowness or the sweetness. I'm sorry, back up. The major second needs to be a little bit bigger than the minor second. I think I was saying third. But it should not be so big that it starts to have that sweetness of a third. That's a third. That's a second. So it has that tension, but it's not quite as dissonant as the minor second. It's a little bit more gray, I think. I think of it as being, sort of gray and murky. Like it could go one way or the other. It doesn't feel very solid to me. Oh, one reason it might feel that way is because I was talking to a student about this the other day. When you hear a major second, it's not clear to the ear which of the two notes is the tonic or which of them is the more fundamental or powerful of the two. And that's because it's really not, it doesn't fit into any chordal scheme. So for example, if I play a C and a D, well, you might think, oh, the lower of the two notes will sound like the tonic. Kind of. But because the D is not an E flat or an E or a G, which would be some of the tones that would be in a C chord, different types of C chords. The D, if I play the D alongside the C, it kind of overrules the power of the C, in my opinion. And the power of the C, that sounds like some sort of Greek mythology fan fiction Poseidon spinoff. But anyway, and in fact, if I play C and D, the C can actually be heard as the seventh of D, albeit placed below. So, for example, that's the seventh, a D, C, that would be a seventh, which is actually, could be part of a D7 chord. So if I play, see, notice now, if I've just played this and then I go like that, this still feels like the tonic, right? Because of the context. Whereas if I play this note first, and then I play this, you might be hearing it as part of this key. So, all of that is to say, major seconds are going to be kind of ambiguous sounding, but you got to just go get on the piano and just practice them. So, give yourself a note. And sing that major second and hold it out and just listen for that signature sound. I don't know how else to describe it. It just is what it is. You'll have to just learn it. And practice it. Okay, next up we have our thirds, minor third. I think these will be fairly easy for most of you because you're familiar with them from major and minor chords, right? Like the beginning of a minor chord, right? Da 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 da. Here's an interesting thing though about minor thirds. They also form the upper part of major chords. Now, you're probably thinking, what is this guy talking about? Well, a major chord, for example, C, E, and G. Now, C to E is a major third, which we haven't talked about yet. But E to G, aka the upper part of that chord, is actually a minor third, even though in this context it's going to sound major. So sometimes I'll trick my students when I'm working on ear training with them. I'll trick them on purpose to teach them something. I'll go like this. And I'll ask them what that interval was, ya-da-da, ya-da-da, like the beginning of Brahms' lullaby, ya-da-da, ya-da-da. And because it's undergirded by this beautiful major chord, they'll say, oh, major third. No, it's a minor third. So you have to understand that intervals can be a part of a larger chord or key that reminds you of a tonality or a quality that is not the actual quality of the interval that we're actually looking at. So this is a C major chord, and when I go E, G, that is actually a minor third. How can you tell? Ya, da, da. Because one of the two steps involved is a half step. So it's a half plus a whole. That's 1.5 or 3 half steps. Ya-da-dee. Or you could sing the interval the other way. Ya-da-da. Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter where you put the step in between. It's either whole half or half whole. Or you could do half half. Half. You could sing the 3 half steps. Ya-da-da-da. Like the little jazzy thing, right? Ya-da-da-da. That gives you a minor third. Da-da-da-da. Now, so far, I've been playing it with the C chord under it. But now, listen to what it sounds like when I change to an E minor. Now, you're like, oh, duh, it's minor. Right? But, so don't always go with the sound of the chord quality behind it. You have to actually sing the interval, isolate it from the chord. Or if you know what the chord is, that can actually give you more information and help you figure out what it is. But anyway, don't be fooled by the surrounding chord or key quality. So, we've got, that's our minor. Now we have our major third. Same exact things apply for the major third, except that I warned you about with the minor chord, except now the major chord, or the major third, can be the upper part of a minor triad. So all the same warnings apply, except with all the names reversed. So for example, that da-dee or ding-dong, like a doorbell, right? That's a major third. Na, na, but when it has this note under it, it might sound minor to the uninitiated. Right? So, but how can you tell it's major? La, because it's composed of 2 whole steps. If you want to get super technical, yeah, you can go ahead and sing all 4 half steps. That is arguably probably harder. But you can see these larger intervals, being absolutely certain about them is going to build on your ability to distinguish half steps and whole steps. So if you're having trouble with that step 1, half steps and whole steps, aka minor and major seconds, go back and, review that. Because you're not going to be absolutely certain about these larger intervals until you can fundamentally distinguish half and whole steps, because they are the building blocks of all Western music, right? Okay. And now we're getting to one that is deceptively difficult. I've noticed that a lot of folks. So we just did the 2/3. Now we're on the perfect fourth. I've noticed that people don't like this one as much, or they are uncomfortable singing it sometimes, because here's my theory. I think it's because when you play a perfect fourth, the upper note actually overrules the lower note, and it becomes the temporary tonic. So what I mean by that is, listen to the beginning of this piece, for example. Right? Famous "Here Comes the Bride." Which of the 2 opening notes is the tonic? Here comes the bride. It's obviously the second one, right? It's not this note, it's this note. That is the home key of the song. So that interval is an ascending fourth. Da da. It's you could do da 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 da. Ya de do de do de. So because a perfect fourth is an inversion of a perfect fifth, and what I mean by that is, let's say, take for example C to F. Well, if the F were under the C, then that interval would be a fifth, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But when you put it on top, it's a 1, 2, 3, 4. It's a fourth, right? So intervals always invert in an adding to 9 pattern, right? So 5 plus 4 is 9, 3 plus 6, 7 plus 2, whatever. So because a fourth is an inverted fifth, and because a fifth is the fundamental building block of scales and chords, then just how in a fifth the lower note is the tonic, then in the fourth the upper note is the tonic, right? And so that's why I've found that sometimes people are a little bit uncomfortable singing perfect fourths, because in all the other intervals they're able to keep the lower note in their head as the tonic, but then when they get to the fourth like sometimes might throw them off because it's just so strong that or they might sing it correctly but then not be able to return and do the other intervals following it because they've lost their sense of tonality from the original note. But the trick is to just let it happen. Just, it's going to sound very strong and very, to me it always sounds like dun da da da, like a trumpet or something, announcing the king entering or whatever. So just let it be strong, but just keep track of that lower note because you're going to need it going into the next one, right? So yum bum bum ba, and that is the next one, right? The famous augmented fourth or tritone, also known as a diminished fifth, depends on how you name it, right? If it's C to F sharp, then it's an augmented fourth. If it's C to G flat, then it's a diminished fifth. Tritone is the generic name, right? Why is it called tritone? It's kind of an interesting glimpse back into history. A tonus in Latin referred to what we call a whole step today. And so tritonus, or three tones, would be the interval composed of three whole steps. So we have da na 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 na. Put that together, we have a tritone. So anyway, this one is fundamentally dissonant, as I'm sure a lot of you know. You know, it's sort of like the minor second. It's sort of famously dissonant. Why is that? Well, the ratio is not mathematically pretty to look at. It's it's actually the square root of 2 is the ratio, which is 1 point something something. Some crazy decimal. It's not a nice fraction. It's not very nice. And also, it's exactly halfway between a perfect fourth and a perfect fifth, which are, of course, both very normal and consonant-sounding intervals. So it kind of sounds like the interval that can't make up its mind where it's going, right? It either wants to be this or that, but it's neither one. It just is what it is, right? So that one, you kind of have to... When I sing an augmented fourth or diminished fifth, I think of it as going to usually the fifth, if I'm being honest, especially when I'm doing this exercise. If we're going up, 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 I think of it as a leading tone into the fifth. So what I mean by that is I'm trying to hear na na na. Perfect example is the song from West Side Story, Maria, Maria, right? Or The Simpsons. Simpsons is a kind of a cool little theme song. It's got a lot of interesting intervals in it. But anyway, Maria or The Simpsons is going to give you that tritone. Both of those go tritone fifth. So they both resolve in a way that I think is very helpful for learning the interval. Because what you got to do is you start singing that and then you just don't resolve it, and that gives you your tritone. Marie, Marie, Marie. Right? Oh, we haven't been testing these on the piano. Well, you now get the idea. You can test these yourself. So the way you do it is you play a note, you sing the note, and then you try to sing the interval in question, and then you play the key to test it. All right. So, tritone. It's a tricky one, but it is a very distinctive one. So I don't think it's actually that hard. You should be able to get it with a little bit of practice. Perfect fifth. The only thing about perfect fifths is that sometimes people will mix them up either with fourths or octaves. So unisons, octaves, fourths, and fifths all live in the same little family, which is that they're consonant, but they're bland. They're very medieval and sort of trumpety sounding. So, for example, thirds and sixths are much more sweet, like so, or... But listen to fourths and fifths. They're more like a little bit more majestic. Think like I said, like brass or medieval kind of sound, right? So sometimes people mix up fourths and fifths, but again, the big distinction is that a fourth is going to sound like the upper note is the tonic. Here comes the bride. So for fourths, think Here Comes the Bride. Fifths are going to sound a little bit more resolved and a little bit more like, I don't know what the word is, like home, more of like a home, like, oh, this is the home key, we're in the tonic kind of thing, right? Because that needs to resolve, doesn't it? But that's where it's at, right? So, and the reason why that is because, like I explained before, the fifth, the lower tone, the fifth is, of course, the basis for our chordal harmony. And so it's going to give us a sense of home, right? So a good thing to practice would be you'd probably would have to get a friend and just have a friend play on the piano either fourths or fifths. So in fact, let's try a few. Now try not to look at what I'm doing with my fingers. But let's try a few. Fourth or fifth. So what you need to think to yourself is, does it sound like Here Comes the Bride, or does it sound like let's see. Well, what would be a fifth one? Well, a good example for both of them is the Star Wars theme. Yan dun 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 dun. So that first bit is the fourth. Da na, because that's like sol do. Remember, fourths don't have to be do fa. They can be sol do. They can occur anywhere in the scale. So the Star Wars starts with a fourth and then it has a fifth. So you just have to think, does it sound like the first part of Star Wars or the second part? So here we go. What do you think? Sing it back. Ya-dee. That's the important first step to recognizing any interval. You have to sing it. Don't sit there and think, oh, I'm not a singer. No. You have to sing these in order to get better at ear training. That is an absolute, it's just mandatory. So sing them back and listen to your own voice. Ya-dee, ya-dee, ya-dee. What does it sound like? Hopefully you're able to tell it sounds like ya dun 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 dee. The first part of that, which is the perfect fourth. So the second tone is the tonic of that little exchange. Yum bum. Right? Anyway, you can test yourself like that with a friend. All right, so we've covered fifths. Let's try to move quickly through the last few that we have. So now we're coming to a couple of sweeter ones. These are the sixths. So first comes the minor sixth. And much of the same caveats apply for the two types of sixths as we discussed for the thirds. Sixths are the inversion of thirds. So for example, a minor sixth in one sense is going to sound very minor, minor being sort of a buzzword for dark or mysterious or solemn, right? In one sense, it will sound very minor because if you hear this as the tonic, then this feels like it's hovering above the fifth. So in that sense, a minor sixth can have a very minor, characteristically minor sound because it's a half step above the fifth in a minor key, right? So, right, very mysterious and sort of epic, right? So for example, I can't think of a popular song that does that, but that's the minor sixth right there. That's one of the Kyries from the, one of the, which one is that? I think that's called Missa Orbis Factor. Anyway, one of the Gregorian chant mass settings. So anyway, another good example would be no, that's not it. What am I thinking of? The X-Files. Yeah, the little background part in the X-Files theme. You know, that little... That, in the background part, that dissonant note you hear at the top is the minor sixth. So it can have that very dark minor sound, but the thing to watch out for is when it takes place in a different context. So what about this? Right? As of right now, it probably still sounds ominous to you, doesn't it? Because of the context. Now let's check this out. Now listen. Same exact interval. But it sounds so much more innocent now, doesn't it? Yada, yada. And in that sense, you could think of the beginning of The Entertainer by Scott Joplin. Yadi, yadi, yadi. That's a minor sixth, even though the chord is major. And it's because it's going from the third of the key to the octave of the key. Right? Anyway, same exact caveats apply for major sixths. Right? Which, like, if you just hear it out of context, you might even be hearing that more as a minor-y type of sound because I was just playing in a key that set us up to hear this as that. But it also can be more of a major sound, right? So the important thing with these sixths is just there's a couple approaches. You can do it by brute force, like sing the intervals in between, like ya da 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 da, and see how many steps you did and where you did a half step. So for example, ya da da da, there's your half step, dun dun. So I just sang 5 steps or 6 notes, and one of them was a half step. That's a major sixth. For example, if you look at a piano C, D, E, F, G, A, that's going to give you a major sixth. And you can see right on the white notes, the way they're laid out, that only has 1 half step between the E and the F. Now, a minor sixth, of course, is going to have 2 half steps in that sequence. Right? But another way to learn these sixths is to memorize all the different ways that they sound in different chords. And I know that sounds like an insurmountable task, but it's really not. So for example, if you play C, A, that's your major sixth. Okay, so you got that down. Now just listen to the way it sounds played over an A minor, and then played over an F major. Those are kind of the 2 main ones you'd want to memorize, right? So in the first case, C to A is the 3rd to the tonic of A minor. But if you play it over F, it's the 5th to the 3rd of F major. Right? So same interval I'm playing in my right hand both times. So just experiment with both of those sounds and get those into your sort of mental repertoire, right? And you can do the same thing with the minor sixth. For example, C to A flat. Play it alternately over an A flat major chord or an F minor. And you can also play it over C minor, and then you'll sort of hear the way it sounds over. Then you'll hear the more dissonant version, right? In that sense, the A flat's not actually part of the chord, but you'll hear how it interacts with that tonic chord, right? So C. So if I'm doing the C over A flat, I could do A flat major, F minor, and then I could do a C minor, just so I hear that dissonance, right? And you could practice singing all these things, and then you could go to the C to A, the major sixth. You could do A minor, F major, then you could do the C major. Because it is useful to know what does a major sixth sound like over a tonic chord based on the lower note of that interval. 1, 3, 5, 6, do, mi, sol, ha. Okay, enough about sixths. Sevenths are going to correspond to seconds. They are the inversions thereof. So the minor seventh is going to be the less dissonant of the two. The minor seventh will correspond to the major second. So the minor seventh has that similar kind of vague gray sound, if you will, that I described earlier. Although maybe not quite as vague, and I think the reason why the minor seventh is less vague sounding than the major second is because in Western music we use a lot of seventh chords. Meaning chords that go root, third, fifth, seventh. And so we're more accustomed to hearing sevenths in modern music than we are seconds. At least harmonically speaking. Of course, seconds happen all the time in melodies, but not as much in harmonies. So sevenths are going to be a little stranger melodically, but harmonically they'll feel a little more normal. So it's not every day you sing yada, but harmonically it forms a fundamental part of a lot of the chords we hear on a daily basis. So da 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 dee, oh. A minor seventh, you got to be careful with this one because it often appears in multiple guises. So it might actually be part of an honest to goodness minor seventh chord, which features our friends from earlier, the minor third and the perfect fifth, and now the minor seventh, right? But you got to be careful because it also can appear as part of a dominant seventh chord, which is considerably brighter and will remind you of a major key, but is not actually a major chord. Well, it has a major triad, but the seventh is minor. That's why sometimes in music theory parlance, they'll call that a major minor seventh chord, which means it has a major triad, but the upper tone is a minor seventh. So remember, minor doesn't always mean sad. Get that into your head. A minor interval doesn't always sound sad. It's about the literal distance between the notes. You have to be responsible for understanding the harmonic context. So, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, te. That's one way to get there, is to sing it as if it's a major scale and then lower the seventh. Another way to think about it is to think of it as being, think of the first note as being sol, la, ti, do, re, mi, fa. So you can think of it as ranging from do to te or from sol to fa. Those are two good ones to be aware of, right? Sol, la, ti, do, re, mi, fa. Sol, fa, mi, right? Y'all will have to write in the comments if you can think of songs for each of these, because I know there's famously pieces that are taught in music theory classes where, this piece will remind you of this interval and use this interval to think of this one. And I can't remember what they are at the moment. But I also would give you a small caveat against those, because those will only teach you the intervals in one harmonic context. You really need to explore them with different settings in order to fully understand these. So that's the minor seventh, yada, yada. And then we have the major seventh, which is very hard to sing because you're going to want to sing either the minor seventh or the octave, but it's ya, dee. Just like the half step from earlier, aka the minor second, it's going to sound dissonant. So for example, go to your piano, play a C, and then try to sing the B above it. That's the sound you want, is that dissonance. Does the octave so go right beneath that? Now, just like with the half step, the major seventh isn't always a bad thing. It's used for color, right? It's really used in two main ways. One way is melodically for color, right? To create a dissonance that resolves into a consonance, usually either the octave or the major sixth on either side. It can also be used as part of a chord, in which case it has a considerably sweeter sound because it combines with the other notes in the chord in a more consonant way. So for example, that outer shell is quite dissonant, right? The C to the B, which is the major seventh. But if I fill in the middle with E and G, now all of a sudden you have a fifth and a third forming with that B, which makes the overall effect quite pleasant. So, one way to think of a major seventh is to think of somewhere, oh, but you got to isolate the O of the word over. It's not the where. That's an octave, which I'm sure all of you can probably sing. Somewhere, oh. That's the best way to get a major seventh in tune. is think of the octave first and then just go, just edge it down ever so slightly. Just, you know, let your voice just relax the tiniest bit and listen for that dissonance. Somewhere over the rainbow, right? But that's the one. Okay? And last but not least, the octave, which I don't have any tips for other than if you don't know what that sounds like, just go to the piano and start singing them because they're ubiquitous in all kinds of music from all over the world and all periods of history. And why is that? Because the octave is a natural interval that results from any instrument. For example, if I pick up this banjo that is probably not tuned in the slightest. There it is. You hear that? That interval that I'm playing up here, I'm not actually fretting the banjo. I'm not actually pressing the string down. I'm actually just touching the string in a particular place. This technique is called a harmonic. I'm just touching the string in a particular place that causes the vibration to, because I'm touching the string, it necessarily has a point of no displacement or vibration where I'm touching it, because I'm touching it. And that creates what we call a node. So now instead of the wavelength being able to take the full length of the string, it has to divide into two parts. What did I say about octaves? It's a ratio of 2. So the wave that is created by the open string is, if I cut the wavelength in half by putting my finger here, the frequency will double. Why? Because the speed of sound is constant. So if the wavelength is half as long, then there has to be twice as many of them per second in order to reach the destination at the same speed, aka the speed of sound, which is why the octave is exactly twice the frequency of its predecessor, right? So the octave is a natural harmonic interval that, for example, that octave would be happening here if there were no frets here. So the frets are man-made, right? Those are like decided by humans where those go. But even if there were no frets here, and so any instrument, any resonator will have an octave if you just create a node at the halfway point because of that 2-to-1 ratio thing that I just explained. So the octave is one of the most universal, or actually I can safely say it is probably the most universal interval in music, in human music. As if there, well, I guess there's like bird. Yeah, there's animal music. So anyway, the only reason it's hard to sing is just because it's a bit of a stretch in terms of the range, right? But in terms of hearing it, it should be fairly easy. You should hear that perfect consonance. There's no debate around what an octave should sound like, right? There is historical debate about thirds, sixths, and all fifths and fourths and all the other ones. There are different ways to tune thirds, seconds, thirds, fourths, fifths, sixths, and sevenths. There is only one octave, and that's why I love octaves. It has to sound like that. There's no other way to tune it. All octaves should always sound exactly like that. They should sound exactly in tune. There should not be any warbling or wavering or wobbling, right? It should sound like una voce, one voice. It should sound like one note. That does it for today's lesson. So go to the piano, practice these intervals, try them with different chord underlays. I know this was a lot of information, so if you have any questions, please send me a message or write a comment, because I would love to hear what all of you guys think about this lesson. All right, happy practicing, and see you all next time.